Since I moved into this apartment, my life has been in chaos. It wasn't exactly my choice, but the need to start over after the breakup pushed me into a new place. The building is old, but it was in good condition and the rent was affordable. At first, everything seemed perfect, but soon, strange things started happening. First, my keys disappeared without explanation. It wasn't just once. Every time I left them on the table, they vanished. I couldn't understand what was going on until I began noticing other oddities. My phone, for example, started freezing, and once it turned on by itself in the middle of the night, as if trying to tell me something. But the most unsettling thing of all was hearing footsteps in the hallway, and no one was ever there when I went to check. I started to think that maybe I was just paranoid, that the end of the relationship was still affecting me. But then my neighbor, an eccentric woman who always kept to herself in her apartment, came into the picture. At first, she just seemed like another strange tenant in the building, but her habits intrigued me. She rarely left, and when she did, her eyes seemed empty, as if she was looking at something no one else could see. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to talk to her. I went to her apartment, and we started talking about the peculiarities of the building, until she looked at me with a strange smile and said, "I've never seen you before." I didn't quite understand, and then she said, "You've been living in the apartment above mine for years." Froze. How could she say that? I had just moved in, and now everything I thought I knew about my new home was turning into a nightmare. Those words kept hammering in my mind for days. I knew I had moved in recently, but she seemed so sure, so calm in her statement. The feeling of unease kept growing. I still thought I was experiencing a hallucination, a side effect of the stress from the breakup. But the events that started happening after that only made things more confusing. The keys kept disappearing, and one night, I heard more footsteps. It wasn't just footsteps. It was as if someone was approaching my door. I couldn't understand why this was happening. I had only been living in that apartment for a few weeks, and everything felt so wrong. I decided to investigate more about the building and my neighbor. I began observing her behavior more closely. She always seemed to know when I was home, but had never seen me. And the strangest part was that she never seemed to leave her apartment. I would occasionally see her through the cracks in the door, but always quickly, as if she were trying to hide what she was doing. Then, on one of those nights, I had the courage to knock on her door again, but instead of receiving me, she gave me an even stranger smile. She didn't say anything, just stared at me, and at that moment, everything grew darker. The hallway, which once seemed normal, now felt like an extension of my own nightmare. I went into her apartment, but what I found there was even more disturbing. Upon entering her apartment, I was shocked by what I saw. There were no furniture, just a single chair in the center of the room, and a large wall covered with newspaper clippings and photos. Each of these photos had a red mark, as if someone had circled certain points, but nothing made sense. It was as if she was documenting something I didn't understand. When I looked at her, her eyes were fixed on me, and for a moment, I thought she was about to tell me the truth. But instead she said, "You still haven't realized, have you? This has all happened before." I didn't understand anything. She looked at me for a few more seconds, and before I could react, she turned and left the room, as if leaving me there to process everything on my own. I stood frozen, trying to understand what she meant. I went back to my apartment, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, something even stranger happened. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard the door of my apartment slowly creak open. It wasn't me. I quickly got up and ran to the hallway, but there was no one there. The lights in the building started flickering, and for a moment, the entire building seemed like it was about to collapse. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just my neighbor who was strange. The building itself seemed to be swallowing me, as if it harbored something more, something ancient and dark, waiting for me. In the following days, things only got worse. I started finding strange notes scattered throughout my apartment, written on scraps of paper as if someone was leaving messages for me. One said, "The truth is in the mirror." I ignored it for a while, thinking it was just another obsession, but curiosity took over. I went to the bathroom mirror and started staring at my reflection. Nothing happened. I almost laughed, thinking maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then something in the back of the mirror caught my eye, a shadow. I couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like a face, as if it was getting closer. The reflection suddenly distorted, and I almost fell backward in fright. I decided I had to know more. I went to the building's management office, and with a little insistence, I managed to get information about previous tenants. What I found left me in shock. There were records of tenants who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving no trace, and every one of them without exception, had lived in the same apartment I now occupied. The story of each of them mirrored mine. Personal problems, feelings of isolation, a growing sense of being watched. The last tenant who lived there simply vanished, as if they had never existed, and according to reports, they also had an eccentric neighbor, someone who seemed to know more than they should. The discovery shook me to my core. I'd already started suspecting that something was wrong, but now I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I was trapped in a cycle, and the more I tried to escape, the more the building seemed to pull me back. That night, the feeling that something was watching me reached an unbearable point. I heard footsteps at the door, but when I went to check, no one was there. The hallway was empty, except for an open door at the end, the door to my neighbor's apartment. As if drawn by an invisible force, I walked toward it, not knowing what to expect. Upon entering, the room was different. The photos on the walls were more numerous, and now they all showed the same face, mine. I looked at my neighbor, and she was sitting in the chair as if waiting for me. Her eyes didn't blink, and she said with chilling calmness, "You finally understood, haven't you? You've always been here. You'll always be a part of this." At that moment, I didn't know if she was talking about me, the building, or something even more terrible. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I realized I was no longer alone in those walls. Something was moving. Something older and more sinister, something that had been waiting for me all along. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The tension in the air was unbearable. The silence in my neighbor's apartment was so thick I could almost feel the pressure in my ears. Suddenly, I began to see something moving in the corner of the room. A fluid shadow, as if the very space was twisting. I looked at her, but her eyes were empty, devoid of emotion, just a fixed gaze that pierced right through me. I no longer knew what was real. I tried to take a step back, but my feet were glued to the floor as if the wood had turned into glue, holding me there, preventing my escape. At that moment, my neighbor spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "You're not leaving, Evan. You'll never leave." Despair overwhelmed me. My heart was racing, and my mind was scrambling. I tried to remember how I got there, but every thought seemed to dissipate as soon as it formed. I was losing my identity, my sense of time and space. Then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was there, but when the light returned, my neighbor had disappeared. I was in the hallway, back in my apartment, as if nothing had happened, but the photos were there in the mirror, reflecting my image. And more frighteningly, in the background of the last photo, there was someone staring at me. My neighbor's face. I finally understood. She wasn't the only one. All the other tenants were there too, fixed presences in time, waiting for me to join them. I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue in this cycle. It wasn't just the feeling of being trapped. I was truly being consumed by it. With every attempt to escape, the building pulled me back, as if physically tethered to it. The feeling of being watched, of being part of something much bigger than me, was more than just fear. It was a battle for my own sanity. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, the feeling that something controlled me began to fade. I looked at the mirror, at the photos, at the now empty hallway that still seemed to imprison me. That's when something inside me, perhaps the last shred of will, awakened. Something told me to run, to get out of there. And that's exactly what I did. I ran to the front door as if fleeing from a nightmare, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty walls. I didn't look back. I didn't try to understand what was happening. I just ran. When the door finally opened, the moonlight blinded me momentarily. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, but when I felt the fresh night air fill my lungs, something inside me calmed down. I was out. I had broken the cycle. The building that had seemed to devour me every second, was now behind me. I knew the experience was real. I went through it, survived, and escaped. It wasn't just a story. I still feel the weight of what I lived, but I know I'm free now. I don't know how long I was trapped there, but I can say with full certainty that I am no longer part of that story. I got out of there, and I'm here to tell it like a warning. If you feel something strange in your building, something that doesn't fit, that makes you look over your shoulder, don't ignore it. Because maybe, just like it happened to me, the place has already decided you're the next story it will tell. I was with Brian, and suddenly, the trip we thought would be peaceful turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. We We decided to rent a cabin in the forest to escape the crazy pace of our lives, and at first, it seemed like the perfect choice. Everything was isolated, far from the city, and the peace of the place felt exactly like what we needed. But soon, things started to get strange. The first few nights were calm, but every morning when we woke up, we found the windows slightly open. We always locked them before going to sleep, and it didn't make sense for someone to have entered, but it seemed like something was trying to show us that we weren't alone. It was Amanda who first noticed. She started saying that she felt like she was being watched. At first, I thought it was just the tension from the trip, but then I started to feel it too. That place, which was supposed to be our refuge, began to feel oppressive. We started having nightmares. I've never been much of a dreamer, but there at night, it was impossible to sleep without being invaded by terrifying images. Each night, the dreams became more vivid, more real. And one night, we woke up to a sound, a low scratching on the bedroom door. When we looked, we saw a figure, a shadow, standing at the entrance, just watching us. I don't know how to explain it, but the feeling was that this figure knew everything about us. We were frozen. Brian tried to get up, but the figure disappeared as soon as he moved. We went to the door looking for any sign of someone, but there was nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no marks, nothing. The door was locked from the inside. Then we started to panic. How could someone have entered without leaving a trace? I began to question everything, and with each passing minute, the fear grew stronger. We weren't alone. Something or someone was there with us. Something we didn't understand. In the following days, the fear only increased. We tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for what was happening. The more we tried, the more bizarre the events became. The windows, which we always locked before sleeping, continued to appear slightly open every morning. Amanda began refusing to sleep alone, and I could barely close my eyes without feeling a shiver running down my spine. Each time we woke up, it felt like the atmosphere of the cabin became thicker, more suffocating. We started to notice more things, small details, but enough to make us uneasy. Objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places. A glass that Amanda had left on the table the previous day, found on the shelf the next morning. A constant feeling that something was watching, waiting. The trees outside seemed darker and more oppressive. I had never felt so much tension in such a quiet place. I was starting to lose control. My mind was betraying me, and I didn't know what was real and what was just fear taking over. The night that marked me the most, however, was when the figure appeared again. We were having dinner, trying to distract ourselves, when suddenly the lights began to flicker. Amanda screamed and pointed to the door. It was her again. The same shadow, the same presence. We couldn't move. We stood there, frozen, staring at the figure that seemed to be measuring us, as if it knew all of our deepest secrets. I didn't know what to do. I just knew that it didn't belong in our reality. It wasn't an ordinary visitor, but something older, stranger. Desperate, we tried to leave. We grabbed our bags and ran to the car, but as soon as we put the key in the ignition, the engine stalled. It was impossible. The car had been working perfectly before. Amanda started crying, and I was about to lose control when suddenly something strange happened. The car started on its own. And that was when the feeling that the cabin was controlling us, that we couldn't leave, intensified, as if that thing, that presence, was telling us that we had no way out. It was then that, without thinking, I yanked the car out of the garage and we drove like never before, not looking back. Throughout the entire journey home, the feeling that we were being followed never left me. I knew we weren't the same after that. I still don't understand what happened in that cabin, but one thing is certain. It wasn't a place for people like us. And to this day, even with the distance, I can feel the eyes of that figure watching me. I've always been a routine guy. When I lost my job, I was desperate, so I took the night security job at the city's mall. The place was quiet, almost deserted at night. I spent the first few weeks just walking through the empty corridors, doing my job, nothing extraordinary. It was easy, actually. But one night, something changed. At first, it was just a whisper, like a distant conversation. I went to the farthest corridors, thinking it might be one of the other guards playing a prank on me, but there was no one. I thought I might be getting paranoid. Maybe the silence and solitude were messing with my head. I was wrong. The next night, the sound came back, but this time, it was clearer. It wasn't just whispers, it was footsteps, like someone was walking through one of the main corridors. At first, I thought it was an intruder trying to break into the place. I ran to the security cameras to check, but what I saw left me speechless. A figure, a shadow, moving through the dark corridors. I couldn't make out the face, but it was clear someone was there. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My mind was confused, but there was a growing sense that something was not right. With each passing night, things got stranger. I no longer knew what was real and what my mind was creating. The figure, always at a distance, appeared on the cameras, but when I ran to the corridor where I saw it, it was gone. I scoured the entire mall, checked all the doors, even the restrooms, but I never found anyone. I started losing sleep. When I looked at the cameras, I saw more than I should have. Whispers, footsteps that seemed to come from empty areas, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it all started consuming me. I knew something was happening, but fear paralyzed me. One night, something different happened. I was doing my usual tour of the mall, already in the farthest part of the building where all the stores were closed and abandoned. That's when I heard a noise coming from a section I had never noticed before. As security, I was very familiar with the mall's layout, but this place, this corridor, wasn't on any of the maps they had given me. I looked around, and although fear had started to take over, curiosity made me walk toward the sound. The corridor was darker than I remembered, and the air was heavy. The lights flickered slightly, almost as if they were about to go out. I moved forward, even though I knew something was wrong. What I found shocked me. An entire section of the mall, a wing that seemed to have been left behind for years. The floor was covered in dust, and the windows were empty, showing no sign of life. But the most terrifying thing was the smell. A musty odor and something else, something I couldn't identify. I shouldn't have been there. I felt a presence behind me, a sensation that I wasn't alone. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. The fear grew, and when I looked at the security cameras, I noticed that the figure I had seen before was now in the corridor as if watching me. It seemed to be slowly moving toward me, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand what was happening, but something told me I was about to discover something I shouldn't. I was frozen, not knowing what to do. The figure on the camera seemed to be getting closer, but when I looked directly at the corridor, it wasn't there. I looked at the cameras again, but this time the image on the screen was distorted, as if something was interfering. The figure was there, now clearer, in its eyes. I couldn't see them clearly, but something about that gaze made me freeze with terror. It was as if it were staring directly at me, even though it wasn't in the same room. I knew I had to leave that place. I felt a growing pressure, as if the entire mall was watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking back toward the main corridor, but the sound of footsteps came from behind me. They were slow, heavy, and each step seemed closer. I didn't dare to look back. I couldn't. As I reached the entrance of the abandoned section, the light went out completely. I was in total darkness for a moment. The only thing I could hear were my own heartbeat and my labored breathing. Then the light came back on, but something was different. I saw the door to the store section locked, but there was no lock. It was open, and on the opposite wall, the figure appeared again, closer, clearer. I wanted to run, but my legs were too weak. In a burst of impulse, I went to the security control panel to turn off the cameras to shut everything down, but when I tried, I realized it was locked. The cameras began showing distorted images as if someone had altered the footage, but the faces were the same. I was looking at faces of people who had disappeared years ago from the mall. My eyes widened when I recognized one of the figures. It was my predecessor, the former security guard. I had never met him personally, but I knew he had mysteriously disappeared a few months before I started the job. His face on the camera was distorted, but those eyes stared at me with a terrifying emptiness. That presence, that evil, which was present on the cameras and in the abandoned section, hit me with full force. I no longer knew what was real. It was as if the entire mall was coming to life. The fear mixed with a sense of despair. I tried to run to the exit, but the emergency door was closed. I heard the footsteps behind me again, now faster, stronger. The terror made me lose control. I was trapped in that place, that prison of walls that whispered and seemed to close in around me. That's when I heard a voice, low and hissing, seeming to come from the walls. "You will stay here forever." I was terrified, not knowing what was happening. The lights began flickering frantically, and the sound of the figure approaching became unbearable. I knew something was very wrong, and the only thing I could think of was how to escape. That's when the door finally opened by itself. I don't know how, but I ran like never before. I didn't look back. When I stepped outside into the street, my lungs burning, I finally stopped to breathe. But the images on the camera screens kept haunting me. I knew I was no longer safe. I was no longer free. Something in that place wouldn't let me rest.